Hey, I had an idea, and I don't want to wait to make a video on Friday to share it with you. It's not really a Friday video idea, so I thought I'd just throw it up here and see what happens, and maybe it'll be useful to you. But I want to talk about volunteers in the church. This is one of the things that gets brought up all the time, is like, how do I get more volunteers for my worship team? Or just in general. And this kind of came up at my church recently because we're looking to move back to 2 services. And whenever you move to 2 services, you need like double the volunteers, essentially, unless people are serving at both services. But you need more volunteers. And so we were going through this process of trying to figure out, what can we accomplish? Like, how many volunteers do we need, and what can we accomplish? And this rule popped into my head in the conversation, and so I went down the rabbit trail in my brain and figured it out. And the rule is this: it's called the 80-20 rule. And this is true in a bunch of areas of life, or generally true, I should say. There's always exceptions to the rules. But the rule is this: that 20% of your blank will get you 80% of the results. So however you want to frame it, in whatever context you want to frame it in, 20% of whatever you're doing is going to lead to 80% of your results. So if you look at it in terms of like business, which I think is where the rule came from, then only 20% of what your business does is going to lead to 80% of the profits. Or if you think about, like, since we're musicians, if you think about your musicianship and you want to get better at your instrument, there's 20% of how you spend your time on your instrument is actually leading to you improving 80% of the way. In church, it translates to this: 20% of the people in your church will be making 80% of the results happen. Or in other words, 80% of the things that happen in your church will be accomplished by 20% of the people in your church. And if you think about that in terms of volunteers, that means that out of your entire church, if we're looking statistically and just looking at the hard statistics, like I said, there's always exceptions to the rule, and maybe you find there's an exception to the rule at your church. That's great if there is. But generally speaking, 80% of what is accomplished at your church is going to be accomplished by 20% of the people. That means that if we take the total size of our church and find 20% of it, multiply it by 0.2, we will find out, generally speaking, how many volunteers we're going to have in our church. And this is thinking on a larger scale. I'll get to our worship teams here in a second. But I just wanted to just do a little math here. So I got my calculator on my phone, and I want to, hopefully this gives you some encouragement. If you're serving in a small church and you're like, I've got like one person on my worship team, I want to show you that that might be normal. So let's do some math here together. Let's say you serve in a church of 75 people. So 75, let's find 20% of that. 75 times 0.2 is 15. So what that says is that essentially you're going to have 15 volunteers in your church. That's it. 15 people out of the 75-person church are going to be doing 80% of the work. These will be your reliable volunteers. So let's take that one step further now and think about our worship teams. And I was looking for some statistics online this morning just about how many people are musicians, quote unquote. And it's really hard to find statistics on that, but from what I found, it's somewhere between 10% and 20% of people are musical in some way. And it seems like in the church there's more musicians than average, so let's go for like 15%. So far we've got our whole church size of 75. We've narrowed that down to you're going to have 15 total volunteers doing most of the work. Now, out of those 15 people, statistically speaking, how many people of those people are musicians? Let's take 15, multiply it by 15, and you get 2.25 people. 15% of 15 volunteers is 2.25 people. So, all of this math, what's it translate to? In a church of 75 people, which is like an average church size, you're going to have 2, maybe 3 people on your worship team. So if that's where you're at right now, you are average. You are not doing anything wrong. That's just the fact of life that 20% of the people will do 80% of the results, and 15% of those 20% of people are musicians. So why don't we do this? In the comments below, why don't you let me know how this math breaks down in your church? First of all, what's your church size? Now take 20% of that, and that'll give you your total volunteers in your church. And then take 15% of that, and that is how many people you could potentially have on your worship team. And then I want to know if the 80-20 rule is true in your church. Let me know in the comments below. I found this to be true in my church. Right now I'm serving in a church of about 100 people. So we've got 100 people, multiply that by 0.2 to get 20% of it. And then we take those 20 people, which is 20% of 100, we multiply it by 0.15, and we've got 3 people. Guess how many people are on my worship team? 3 people. So the rule is true in my church. I'll just want to see if it's true in your church. But I want this to give you, I guess, encouragement in your ministry that you aren't failing if you've only got 20% volunteership in your church and you've got a really small worship team because you're serving in a small church. Like, you aren't going to have a team of 15 people in a church of 75 people. So whenever you look at these bigger churches and you see like, oh my gosh, you got to have planning center in place and you got to have like all of this structure around your ministry because you've got so many people in your church, that you've got so many people in your worship ministry. Like, understand that that is a function of a larger church, and you're not doing anything wrong if you're serving in a smaller church and you don't have that many people on your worship team. So I want this, though, to propel us forward and not just use it as an excuse to be like, well, I serve in a small church, so I don't have a big team. Because we all want to grow our teams, right? We all want more people. That's what we want at my church right now, because we're looking to move back to 2 services sometime in the near future, and we need more volunteers. So what is the practical side of this 80-20 rule for our ministry, apart from using it as an excuse to be like, my team's small, right? The practical side of it is that we can play with the numbers in that formula that I gave you, that we've gone through a couple times now, and we can use that to grow our team, or to give ourselves a path to understand how we can get more volunteers on our worship team. And whenever we look at the formula, church size times 0.2, take that number, multiply it by 0.15 for 15% of that, we can play with those numbers. So what can we do? Well, number one, we could increase the percentage of people volunteering in our church, which is the step that we always go down first, right? So we take a look at that and be like, well, what if we could bump it up to, let's go crazy and say we're going to get to 40% of people serving in our church, which would be a crazy amount. All right, so take 75, the average church size, times 0.4 to get 40%, and then you'd have 30 volunteers to play with. Take that one more step further, and let's say you've got 15% of people are musicians, and that would leave you with, then you get 4.5 people. So 4 to 5 instead of 2 to 3 people on your worship team. So that is the route that we always go down, right? We're like, I just need to ask more people. I need to find more people in my church to serve. And that's not a bad thing. That is one of the ways that you should be trying to grow your team. Or maybe we tweak that 15% number and we're going out and we're teaching people in our church how to play an instrument, therefore raising the ratio, the percentage of musicians in our church. You could do that as well. But we never think about this, what I'm about to share with you, when it comes to getting more volunteers. There's one piece of the puzzle that we haven't altered yet, that we haven't messed around with. We've messed around with the percentages, but what about if we mess around with the number that we have at the beginning of the equation, the size of your church? What if we, instead of focusing on just getting more volunteers in church or for our worship team, we just focused on growing our church? And I know people hate that, like that term church growth, like they think it's a dirty phrase or something, but I don't really get that, because that's what Jesus has called us to do. He has called us to the Great Commission, which is essentially growing the church by spreading the gospel, bringing people into the community of believers. It doesn't matter if they come to your church specifically or if they just find a church to be connected to. But that is our purpose as not just leaders in the church, but just believers in general, is to grow the church by introducing people to Jesus. So what if we focused on that number and actually fulfilled the Great Commission and, oh my gosh, in the process actually got more volunteers at church? It's like Jesus knew what he was talking about all along. So let's mess with that number. Let's say you go from 75 people in your church to 150. And of course, we double, that would be doubling the size of your church. And so you're going to double the amount of volunteers from 15 to 30. And then from that group, you've got 15% of that, which would be 4.5. So which is easier to do is the question I'm asking. And which is more productive? Which is more biblical? Is it to try with all your might to overcome the 80-20 rule and simply get 40% volunteer participation in your church? Is it that, or is it going and completing, accomplishing, focusing on the Great Commission of building your church and doubling your church size from 75 people to 150 people? You get the same result. But think about that, man. Think about that. What happens in the first scenario? We've got a church of 75 people, and we just get more of them to participate. Or we go out and we bring 75 people to Jesus, doubling the size of our church and doubling the size of our worship team, statistically speaking, in the process. I'm sure there's something I'm missing in this conversation. These were just the thoughts that I had today. So I don't have a wrap up for this video. I just want to know your thoughts below. I thought this is just something I've been bouncing around in my head. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Let me know I'm stupid and I am doing the math wrong, or I forgot about something. But think about that formula right here. Church size times 0.2 to get 20%. That's how many people will volunteer. Out of that, multiply that number by 15 or 0.15, and that'll give you 15% of how many musicians you'll have in your church that can serve on your worship team. That's all I have today. Till I see you in the next video. Keep leading worship well.